welcome. We're going to sing two familiar hymns this evening. Number 425 is He Keeps Me Singing, and Victory in Jesus is 426. We're going to sing the first, second, and last of He Keeps Me Singing, and the first one in Victory in Jesus. So join us as we sing together. Would you stand as we sing the worship? First, and last of the first one. And the next page, if you're in the hymn book, is Victory in Jesus, the first stanza. Join us now as we welcome each other to our service.
No. Well, I hope y'all are doing well this evening, and as we have some getting back to their. Chapter 18 tonight. Genesis chapter 18 is where we're at as we continue in our study of the life of Abraham. Now, last time that we were together, we were looking at the unique covenant with Abraham that was set up to set his descendants apart from the rest of the world. And so tonight we're going to look at how Abraham pleads for the lives of the people living in the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. And so tonight, as we get started, we're looking first and foremost at how there were these three visitors that showed up on Abraham's doorstep, basically. And we see this in verses 1 through 5. So follow along with me. We'll read those verses, and then we'll figure out what they're telling us there. It says, "The Lord appeared to Abraham near the great trees of Mamre while he was sitting at the entrance to his tent in the heat of the day. Abraham looked up and saw three men standing nearby. When he saw them, he hurried from the entrance of his tent to meet them and bowed low to the ground. He said, 'If I have found favor in your eyes, my Lord, do not pass your servant by. let a little water be brought, and then you may all wash your feet and rest under this tree. Let me get you something to eat so you can be refreshed, and then go on your way, now that you have come to your servant." "Very well," they answered, "do as you say." So Abraham is camped again near the city of Hebron, just south of Jerusalem. And he's in this place that he must have really liked. He must have really enjoyed the area of Hebron because not far from there is where he would eventually bury his wife Sarah. It's where he would be buried, and some other members of his family. But there was something about this region around Hebron near these great big trees of Mamre that he really enjoyed. And this may have been where he was at when we read in chapter 17. We don't know that for a fact, when God shared with him the covenant of circumcision. But we know that that because of the extreme heat in the middle of the day, in their day, they didn't have air conditioning, they didn't have fans, they just had to hope that a cool breeze would blow through. And so in the heat of the day, they would not be out working in the middle of the day. And it was because of the extreme heat in this region. And so what they would do is they would a lot of times go into their tent, get into the shade under a tree or in their tent to try and cool off for a few hours during the middle of the day, because it was just too hot to work. And so Abraham was in his tent, and these three visitors just show up. They're just out of nowhere. They are there at his camp. And so Abraham went and did something kind of interesting. He went up to them, and then he bowed down to them. The interesting thing about that is that in their culture, bowing was reserved for two people, either royalty or deity. So either for the king or for the King of Kings, let's put it that way. And so what we see is that there was, in this moment, Abraham comes up and he bows, and he recognizes that God is one of the three that is present with him. Now remember, God has appeared to Abraham several times through the text that we have looked at. And so there have been times where God was present with Abraham in some form that Abraham recognized when he was with these other two visitors that this was God. Now, this event where God appears in some sort of physical form is what we call a theophany. It is a physical representation of God who is a spirit. And there are other examples of this throughout the scriptures. You have Jacob, who wrestled with God during the night. You have Moses speaking to God in the burning bush. You have the pillar of cloud by day and the pillar of fire by night, where God represented himself to the nation of Israel during their wilderness experience. There are a lot of examples throughout the scriptures where God in some physical form makes himself present with humanity. And in this event, Abraham realizes it. He knows who it is. He sees God in whatever physical form God took on, and he recognized him, and he bows to him. And so Abraham did what was common then and is even common now, in the fact that hospitality is of vital importance in the Middle East. And we'll even see that put on display in the next chapter when we see what happens when those two visitors get to Sodom. But what we understand is that he offers to show them hospitality, and he does that by providing them with water to wash their feet from their journey, but he also offers them food to eat. And so that leads us to verses 6 through 8, where we see Abraham's hospitality on display. So look at those verses with me as well. It says, "So Abraham hurried into the tent to Sarah. 'Quick,' he said, 'get 3 seahs of the finest flour and knead it and bake some bread.' When he ran to the herd and selected a choice tender calf and gave it to a servant who hurried to prepare it. He then brought some curds and milk and the calf that had been prepared and set these before them. While they ate, he stood near them under a tree." And so basically what we see in this moment is that Abraham goes a step beyond giving them water to wash their feet. He provides them with a meal, and he doesn't provide them with just any meal. He provides them with a big meal. This is a meal worthy of God stepping into the tent or into the camp of Abraham in this day. So I went and looked up the amount of flour that he instructed Sarah to use. And a lot of times we just sort of gloss over these things because it's not units of measurement that we are familiar with. So I thought, well, I'm just going to look this up. And I'm glad I did because it's kind of crazy when you think about it. But the 3 seahs is how you pronounce that. The 3 seahs of flour would have yielded 36 loaves of bread. Because get this, 1 seah equals 12 pounds of flour. And so, yeah, he was, if you didn't hear Matthew, Abraham's walking in saying, woman, get to work. There's a lot to be done. And, there was a lot for her to bake all of a sudden. And so he is giving her the instruction to get 36 pounds of flour together to start baking. And it's crazy that he is having her make so much bread. But in addition to that, the tender calf, you could estimate how old that calf would have been. And fortunately for us, your pastor deals with cattle and beef and all that stuff. Most likely, the likelihood of his slaughtering a young calf like that would have probably yielded at least 20 to 40 pounds of beef or meat for them to eat for 3 people. You imagine sitting down with 15 pounds of meat in front of you to just sit there and eat? I mean, it's just unbelievable what Abraham is doing. Now, remember, Abraham is a wealthy person, so for him, the amount of flour, the amount of meat with a tender calf, all of those things, that wasn't even a drop in the bucket for him. So it wasn't anything for him. But it was an extravagant meal. It was a big meal that he was producing for God and those 2 visitors. And so while they ate, it was kind of interesting when you read that Abraham gets everything together. Sarah has been, sweating over this, working over the hot stove for hours to get this, bread together, and they get the calf together, and he brings the milk and the curds and all of this out there, and he gives it to them. But then he sort of steps back out of the way and takes up, his place under a tree or, out of the way, and is watching, waiting, sort of like a servant, waiting to see if there is anything else that is needed so he can go tell somebody else to do it, right? Fix this calf, fix this bread, and Abraham's a good delegator. He'd made a good manager, right? But nevertheless, he does this. He stands back out of the way and is just watching and just waiting, and that's part of the hospitality that he was showing towards these visitors. But when we go on into verses 9 through 15, we see that for what seems like the upteenth time, a child is promised to Abraham and Sarah again. We see this again. And in verse 9, it says, "Where is your wife Sarah?" She's passed out, exhausted from fixing 36 loaves of bread. We know where she was. She's in the tent, and she's back there, trying to get recovered. But it says, they asked him that. "They're in the tent," he said. Then one of them said, "I will surely return to you about this time next year, and Sarah, your wife, will have a son." Now Sarah was listening at the entrance to the tent, which was behind him. Abraham and Sarah were already very old, and Sarah was past the age of childbearing. So Sarah laughed to herself as she thought, "After I am worn out and my Lord is old, will I now have this pleasure?" Then the Lord said to Abraham, "Why did Sarah laugh and say, 'Will I really have a child now that I am old?' Is anything too hard for the Lord? I will return to you at the appointed time next year, and Sarah will have a son." Sarah was afraid, so she lied and said, "I did not laugh." But he said, "Yes, you did laugh." And so, after eating this meal, Abraham is in this interesting dialogue, into this interesting conversation with these visitors about this child that has been promised to them. And so Abraham and Sarah, as we know, had been promised prior, 25 years prior, by God that they would have a child, and this was when they were 75. Now they're 99. Well, Abraham is 99, so it's been almost 25 years that this has been going on, and they're promised again here that within 1 year they would have a child. And this harkens back to what we just read in chapter 17 last week, where during that covenant of circumcision and it's being introduced to Israel, we see that God promised him, said that within a year you would have a son, you're to name him Isaac. And so what that tells us is that this event in chapter 18 had to have followed very closely on the heels of what we read in chapter 17. And that's because, again, the child is being promised within the year, and so we see that this had to have been the case. It's not like a couple of weeks ago when we saw that there was a 13-year gap between two chapters. So there's probably a matter of weeks, maybe, probably less than a month, that this is coming on the heels of chapter 17. But when they are told that they would have a child and it would be within a year, this isn't the first time that Sarah has heard this, because Abraham would have been promised this in chapter 17. He wouldn't have withheld that from Sarah. He would have shared with Sarah that, hey, this is what God said in this moment of this covenant. And so she hears it this time, and now we're told that Sarah laughed to herself, sort of chuckled under her breath, so to speak, we would say. And she does that at the very thought of her and Abraham having a child at such an old age. So for them, Abraham is 99, she's 89, and just the thought of them having a child, it's humorous to her that, now the Lord's going to give me the blessing of having a child. Now I get the pleasure of holding a child in my arms that is my own. And, notice that that before verse 13 in what we just read, the three visitors are always referred to as what? They. They're always referred to as they. And when one of them speaks, and that indicates that it's probably not God doing the speaking in those comments when they are made. But in verse 13, we read that God, and if you go into the Greek text, it is the word Yahweh, speaking of God. And so we know that it's God speaking here, spoke to Abraham and asked why Sarah laughed, and again promised that they would have a son within the year. And, it's kind of interesting. The thing that I like about the Bible, or one thing I like about the Bible, is that it shows us the humanity of the people in the stories with no filter. There's no filter on these people when we read it. We see them at their best. We see them at their worst. We see them in real honest responses. And that's what we see here with Sarah. She responds at 89 years old like an 8-year-old would when they get busted. What does she do? Nope, that wasn't me. I mean, she does. And she's 89 years old, and that's her response is not to be, we think of Sarah as the mother of the nation of Israel, and this godly woman, but she gets called out at 89 by God, and she's like, I don't know what you're talking about. And that was her response. But she acted like a child would respond when they're called out about something that they've done wrong. And so the problem is she denied laughing. She told, oh, no, that wasn't me. I didn't laugh. And God called her out on it. If there's anybody you're going to try and lie to, is God the one that you want to be lying to? Absolutely not, right? And she does. She denies it. She lies to him. And then he said, yes, you did laugh. And so can you probably felt about that big after God calls her out on it and then says, oh, yeah, you did. And so, it's remarkable to see the humanity in this moment, that she finds it humorous that at 89 years old or 90 years old, she's going to have a child. and she finds it humorous to herself, but in this moment of honesty, she tries to deny it to God. Tries to deny that she laughed. Well, what we see following this is that God's plan is revealed to them about what's going to happen with the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. And so look at verses 16 through 22. It says, beginning in verse 16, it says, when the men got up to leave, they looked down towards Sodom, and Abraham walked along with them to see them on their way. Then the Lord said, shall I hide from Abraham what I am about to do? Abraham will surely become a great and powerful nation, and all nations on earth will be blessed through him. For I have chosen him so that he will direct his children and his household after him to keep the way of the Lord by doing what is right and just, so that the Lord will bring about for Abraham what he has promised him. Then the Lord said, the outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is so great, and their sin is so grievous, that I will go down and see if what they have done is as bad as the outcry that has reached me. If not, I will know. The men turned away and went toward Sodom, but Abraham remained standing before the Lord. So after the meal, after the washing of their feet and enjoying the meal and resting there, we see that the three visitors that have spent time in Abraham's company, they decide they're prepared to leave the camp, and God asks this really interesting question about Abraham or about the situation, and he says, "Shall I hide from Abraham what I am about to do?" And so it's interesting when we see that, because we imagine that God is almost talking to himself, so to speak, in that moment. But he may have very well been speaking to those two other visitors that were with him. And in asking that question, God gives an argument for why he should tell Abraham about what he is going to do in Sodom. And so he not only asks that question, should I tell Abraham what I'm going to do? He supports a yes to that answer. He supports it by saying, should I tell Abraham what I'm going to do? Well, these are reasons why I should. And so he goes on to do that. And in verses 18 and 19, God gives two of the three promises that we have seen repeated throughout this study of Abraham's life. He gives two of the three promises given to Abraham as reasons why he should tell Abraham the plan for Sodom. And God's reasoning for that was based on the fact that Abraham's family line would be a blessing to all the earth. As we know, the Messiah, Jesus, would come through Abraham's family line, and that is the blessing that is referenced. But not only that, he says that Abraham would become a mighty nation. He's referring to the nation of Israel and how they would become a multitude of people, a great nation after Abraham. And so God tells Abraham, after asking the question and then making his case for telling him, he tells him what his plan is, or what is going on in this situation, why God has shown up on earth in the flesh, so to speak, not in the flesh as in Christ, but in person here. It says, the outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is so great and their sin so grievous that I will go down and see if what they have done is as bad as the outcry that has reached me. If not, I will know. And so God is basically saying, look, there has been a lot of complaints about Sodom and Gomorrah and what all is going on, this outcry, and I'm going to go check it out and see if it's the way people are making it out to be. And if it's not, I'll know that it's not as bad as they made it out to be. Any of you ever had two kids in your care or custody or in your home, and one of them comes to you and says, "Oh, you wouldn't believe what the other one did. They've done all this and this and this and this, and then they hit me and I did all this stuff." And you go and you get the other one and like, I don't even know what they're talking about. I was in my room. I was by myself. I was doing whatever. Well, you get them together and you get to listening, and you find out sometimes that what the first one said is not as bad as as what they made it out to be when you get the information from the two. Well, that's what we see with God here, is that God has been listening to this outcry from Sodom and Gomorrah, from the people in the region, the people in the city, about how bad things are in Sodom and Gomorrah. And God's saying, I'm going to figure out whether you're telling me the truth or not. I'm going to figure out which is the case. And so he's going to find out about this. And, we know that God did not have to go and personally inspect, in person, the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. We know that God could have very easily, he would have known in heaven what the situation was. But we see that his presence here in this story, his physical presence in front of Abraham, gave him two opportunities to mold the faith of Abraham and the generations to come, because he showed that he was intimately involved in the problems in Abraham and Sarah's lives, their infertility. He was showing that he was intimately concerned about that. But not only that, he showed that he wants to have discussions with his people, like he had with Abraham, as we'll see in the next few verses, where Abraham is talking to God about the situation in Sodom and Gomorrah. And so we see that God wants to speak to us as well. But after God told Abraham his plan, the two other visitors left to go to Sodom to render judgment, to go and put boots on the ground, so to speak, in Sodom and Gomorrah to find out if the situation was as bad as the outcry against it had warranted. And so the interesting thing is, we're told that that God stayed behind and spoke with Abraham. And that's what we read about in the next 10 verses from verse 23 to 33. It says, "Then Abraham approached him and said, 'Will you sweep away the righteous with the wicked? What if there are 50 righteous people in the city? Will you really sweep it away and not spare the place for the sake of the 50 righteous people in it? Far be it from you to do such a thing, to kill the righteous with the wicked, treating the righteous and the wicked alike. Far be it from you. Will not the judge of all the earth do right?' The Lord said, 'If I find 50 righteous people in the city of Sodom, I will spare the whole place for their sake.' Then Abraham spoke up again. 'Now that I have been so bold as to speak to the Lord, though I am nothing but dust and ashes, what if the number of the righteous is 5 less than 50? Will you destroy the whole city for lack of 5 people? If I find 45 there,' he said, 'I will not destroy it.' Once again he spoke to him. 'What if only 40 are found there?' He said, 'For the sake of 40, I will not do it.' Then he said, 'May the Lord not be angry, but let me speak. What if only 30 can be found there?' He answered, 'I will not do it if I find 30 there.' Abraham said, 'Now that I have been so bold as to speak to the Lord, what if only 20 can be found there?' He said, 'For the sake of 20, I will not destroy it.' Then he said, 'May the Lord not be angry, but let me speak just once more. What if only 10 can be found there?' He answered, 'For the sake of 10, I will not destroy it.' When the Lord had finished speaking with Abraham, he left, and Abraham returned home." So here is this very interesting conversation between Abraham and God, because Abraham is showing that he has compassion for his nephew Lot and Lot's family, because he knows that they live in Sodom. Abraham's also showing that he has compassion on the innocent people who live in both Sodom and Gomorrah. And so he poses this really interesting question to God about whether God would, just sort of strike down the righteous when he strikes down the wicked. And, people oftentimes have this view of God, especially when they are unchurched or non-believing people. They have a little bit of information about the God of the Bible, and they'll say that there is this dichotomy between the two testaments in the Bible, that in the New Testament you have a God of love who sends his son and allows him to die for all of humanity. But you look in the Old Testament and you have this God of wrath, this God of vengeance, this God of justice, and all of this. And so in this moment, you see Abraham not questioning God in whether God will choose to do the right thing, but he's making a point of the fact that if God wipes out the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah wholesale, he just levels them to the ground, then there are going to be some innocent people who are going to be caught up in the destruction. And he asked him, are you going to honestly allow them to pay the price for the sins of the wicked? And so he asked that question, and for the next 9 verses, we see this back and forth with Abraham. He's like, don't be angry with me, Lord, but let me ask you. And then God's like, yes, I'll do it for this. Well, don't be angry with me, but let me ask you this. And back and forth between God and Abraham. And Abraham starts at 50. And his master negotiating skills come into play here. And so he's like, will you do it for 50? Will you do it for 45? Do I hear 40? Do I hear 30? Do I hear 20? And then he gets to 10, and God's like, I've had enough, Abraham. Let's just stop right now. And so he gets to 10, and God, they finish this conversation, and God leaves. But when we read this text, it poses the difficult question for us from a perspective of faith about did Abraham change God's mind, or did God already plan to go down and agree to 10 people, knowing that was what Abraham would ask and would eventually get to? And so we think about that question, and this is tough to answer. And the reason for that is because we know that God is omniscient, meaning that he knows all, that there is not anything that surprises God. God knows everything. And so he knew that Abraham would ask about the righteous being wiped away with the wicked. And God knew that Abraham would keep lowering the bar for the city of Sodom and trying to continually get down to a manageable number. And so we see that and we think, well, on that side, we think, okay, well, God does know everything, and that may be the case. But on the other side, does it mean that Abraham changed God's mind based on a standard of justice, that God would not punish the righteous with the wicked? And so we think about that, and we can see that it would go either way. Now, I'll be honest with you, I tend to lean more towards the God is omniscient, and he knew that Abraham would try and whittle away at the number and get it down to 10. That is my belief. I may be right, I may be wrong, and when we get to heaven, we'll know, and it won't matter. That's sort of the omniscient part, is that God, and if you didn't hear Keith, what he said was, that what if God is omniscient and he knew there weren't 10 righteous people in Sodom? And I think that is probably more so the case, that God was omniscient and knew that Abraham would get him down to that number, but God knew that there wasn't 10 righteous people in 2 cities. I mean, cities of several hundreds of people, if not thousands of people. And so, that's very well the case. Steve? Yeah.
I think, like you said, I think he already knows how many was good and how many was bad. But it showed Abraham through him dropping the number when he's compassionate.
Yeah, definitely. It is a sign of God's compassion as much as it is Abraham's concern and compassion for the people there. But the fact that God is willing to show his compassion in that way, Abraham probably felt confident. On the flip side of that, going back to Keith's idea here, God is confident that there are not 10 righteous people in Sodom, or he would have lowered it to 5 or 4 or whatever. He would have let Abraham continue to whittle it down. And so God is probably confident that there's not more than 10 righteous people in Sodom. Yes. Yeah, Yes, David makes a good point here that God didn't have to go down to Sodom. He knew the hearts of the people, and so this was more a lesson for Abraham and for us probably more than it was God doing that. Yes, ma'am. I think God put the brakes on it at 10. I think that God was done at 10 because God knew how many righteous there were in the city, and if he allowed Abraham to go, what number would Abraham have ended up at? Because he knew who was in the city, Lot. And his thought would have been that Lot is righteous and maybe Lot's family. And that's sort of the next part of my notes is that, Abraham probably felt confident that there had to be at least 10 people in the city that are righteous. And God's knowing, nope, there isn't. And I know that there isn't. And I'm going to bring about this judgment against Sodom and Gomorrah on a biblical scale that will be a lesson on sin and wickedness and my judgment of it. I think is what it is. But see, Abraham is on the flip side of that. He's probably, he's like, God, let's go with 50. Let's go with, he's working him down. And Abraham's probably in the back of his mind doing the math in his head. Okay, there's Lot and his salty wife, and then not ruining next week. So there's Lot and his wife and their 2 children, and we know that from the story next week that Lot's daughters were engaged to be married. So they had 2 more. They had son-in-laws or soon-to-be son-in-laws that Abraham is probably thinking in his mind, okay, there's the 4 of the family, there's the 2 son-in-laws. That's 6 people that are righteous. There has to be 4 other people. There has to be 4 other righteous people in town. So he's like, okay, if I can, he's doing this, breaking down of the numbers with God, and he gets to 10, and God sort of, as best we can tell, God just sort of, they stop at this point. Or Abraham would have went down to 4 or 3 or 1. Who, Abraham or? Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, that may be the case. But, after God's final agreement here, he gets to this point, and Abraham is, although we know crossing our fingers doesn't do anything, he's sitting there crossing his fingers like, okay, I think I probably figured out enough people that, that will probably not get the city destroyed. Yes, ma'am. Very well could have been the case. I have never thought about that. We know from the scriptures, what we know is that he had 2 daughters, but he could have had more daughters, and they could have had, or more children, and they could have had spouses that would have attributed to that number. So that may have been why Abraham stopped at 10. I've never thought about that, but that is a very real possibility. And yeah. He may, how is it? He puts it there at the very end. He says, may the Lord not be angry with me. Just let me speak once more. What if only 10 were found there? And then God says, for the sake of 10, I will not destroy it. It may have been, for the sake of 10, I will not destroy it. It may have been that kind. Stop it, Abraham. It may have been that kind of a mentality or that kind of inflection in his tone come on, Abraham, we're stopping at 10. But we don't know because we read it and we read it straight off the page and we sort of imply our own inflection and our own tone on it. But we don't know how God is responding with his tone to Abraham during all of this. And so after God's final agreement to spare the city for 10 righteous people, that we see that he leaves and Abraham returns home. And so, as we have looked, this has been a very interesting chapter for us to look at, but there are life lessons for us to learn from the life of Abraham, even in this chapter. And the one that I think, there's several that we could look at, but the one I think that that sort of stuck out to me this week was that sin cannot be hidden from God. The sins in Sodom and Gomorrah, they couldn't be hidden. The sin of Sarah laughing, even though she laughed to herself, could not be hidden from God. Her laughing, and her laughing was not the sin in this case. the denial or the lie of sinning or the lie of not laughing is where she sinned. But God called her out on it, like we talked about earlier. He called her out because she lied, and he said, no, you did. I know that you did. And then the people of Sodom and Gomorrah, they were beyond sinful, beyond anything we could ever imagine. Now, when we read next week in chapter 19, what we see is that one of the sins, I don't want to say the primary sin, the sin that is a focus in chapter 19 for Sodom and Gomorrah was homosexuality. But then, if you go to Ezekiel chapter 16, you don't need to, I'm just going to tell you sort of a paraphrase of it. In verses 49 and 50, we see that there are other sins that Sodom and Gomorrah were guilty of that the prophet Ezekiel tells us about. And he says that they were guilty of sins that included pride, apathy, complacency, idleness, and unconcern for the underprivileged. And so we can even be confident because they were Canaanites, we can be confident that we could add pagan idol worship to their list of sins. And so we see that Sodom and Gomorrah is not pegged with just one sin, as so many will often try and sort of peg them with, it's just about homosexuality, and that's why God destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. Sodom and Gomorrah, the people in Sodom and Gomorrah were sinful beyond belief to the point that God was willing to, at least at first when he talked with Abraham, do away with the righteous and the wicked at the same time. And so they had a plethora. They had a laundry list of sins that they were guilty of, not just one. And what we see, though, is that Sarah thought she could sin and it would go unnoticed because she wanted to save face. The people of Sodom and Gomorrah thought nothing of the way that they lived their lives. It was the way their parents had lived, and it's the way that they were going to live, and they didn't see anything wrong with it. And both of them thought their sin was no big deal. But God takes sin seriously. Whether it was Sarah, the people in Sodom and Gomorrah, or any of us, our sin cannot be hidden. We may be able to hide it from our church. We may be able to hide it from our friends. We may even be able to hide it from our family. But we cannot hide our sin from God. The fact that Sarah laughed to herself and God knew about it should give us a real pause for concern for those thoughts that we have in our head that we never verbalize. Woo! That ought to scare us all to death. I mean, it really should. I mean, yeah. But, I mean, the fact, though, is she was trying to even hide that laughter rather than being like some of us on the ground laughing. She tried to hide it by internalizing it. And that shows us that God knows our thoughts. And so our sin, as you hear me say so many times from the pulpit or from the podium here, that our sin pushes us away from God. What it does is it interferes with our relationship with Him. So there is no way for it to go unnoticed by Him, or for us to hide it so that it doesn't affect our relationship with Him. I mean, think about that. Our sin, whether it's something we say, something we do, whatever it is, our sin automatically puts, interference, puts, that spiritual separation between us and God. It does not go unnoticed by Him because it is a spiritual matter and God is spirit. God is God. And so He naturally is offended by our sin the instant that it happens. And so whether it's a thought, whether it's an action, whether it's something we say, it immediately causes that interference between us and Him. And so trying to hide our sin can only cause us to compound the problem, and it can lead to even more sin. I had thought about this when we talked about the story of Abraham and Sarah and Hagar. And somebody, I can't remember who it was, talked to me in the lobby or after the church, after service, and we were talking about it. And here is the thing, and to show you about how sin is compounded and stuff. Remember when Abraham and Sarah go to Egypt because of the famine? And Abraham's like, oh no, she's my sister, she's not my wife. And so Pharaoh takes Sarah into his harem and does what? He gives Abraham servants and animals and, a lot of wealth. There's no doubt that the Egyptian slave Hagar was one of those servants that because he lied about who his wife was, he received Hagar. Well, that is compounded by the fact that when they get back to Canaan, who is the one that eventually becomes the one that causes the rift between them, and not that Hagar causes the rift. There is a rift because of Abraham and Sarah's poor choices. And so they use Hagar as the surrogate, and then that causes problems. And it's just the sin is compounding because now they have this option for doing something that is outside of God's plan. And so it shows us that our sin, when we try to cover it up, when we try to hide it, or when we try to do something outside of God's plan, there is a really good likelihood that we will be like Sarah. No, I didn't. And like the 8-year-old. No, I didn't. And what is it going to do? It's going to compound, and it's going to be worse. The best thing that we can do once we realize that we have sinned is to seek God's forgiveness and then repent. That's the best thing that we can do. And that, because rather than trying to cover it up, rather than trying to hide it, rather than trying to rationalize it or justify it or whatever, we need to do exactly what the scriptures teach us. We need to seek God's forgiveness, and then we need to repent of it. And so that is our study of Genesis chapter 18. Are there, y'all have had some good questions already. Are there any other questions this evening? Any questions at all? No, I'm just checking. Go ahead, Kay. One is God. The other two, as we'll see in chapter 19, are two angels. And so I purposefully referred to them as visitors tonight because we'll talk about that next time. But the other two are visitors. The other two visitors are angels. Rob? The other two are the ones that actually go into the city of Sodom. And so we talk about how in heaven God can't be in the presence of sin. That's why there's no sin in heaven, or sinners aren't allowed into heaven, I guess I should say. But when we think about that, what does that say about Sodom and Gomorrah? Was it so depraved and so sinful that God couldn't even, he sent the two angels rather than him going in himself, in whatever physical form he was in. Maybe the case. Right. I hadn't thought about that. That's a good idea. Lisa? That's a good question. The best answer I have for you off the cuff is that there are other instances where other people saw God. You have Moses and Joshua and the 70 leaders of Israel that ate a meal and were in God's presence and things like that. It may be more along the lines. My first answer would be, and I would have to double check this with some real study, is that the idea there is that nobody has seen God in his form as a spirit and survived, but I don't know that that's the exact right answer, but I'll do some study and find out. Alta? Yeah. Right. Yeah. Right. Yeah. Alta has a good answer for you, Lisa. But I agree with Alta. Alta said more eloquently what I was trying to say. But I agree with Alta that we haven't seen God in His full glory, and even think about the disciples on the Mount of Transfiguration when Jesus is transfigured in front of them, and they get to even a glimpse of His glory. They can't handle it, so to speak. But what we see is that there are so many cases. You've got the pillar of cloud and pillar of fire. Well, the whole nation of Israel will be dead at that point if that was considered the presence of God. And it is God. It is a theophany. It is the presence of God leading them. But it's not God in His unfiltered glory, which would kill us, so to speak. I think that's a better answer than what I said to begin with. But I think it has to do with the glory of God rather than just the physical presence of God. Yep. So can you imagine that in the new heaven and the new earth, God's going to be the light. We're not even going to have a sun. So you can imagine how radiant the glory of God is and what it would do to a mortal person. So that's a great question, Lisa. Any other questions? All right. Well, appreciate you being here tonight, and thank you for being here for our study. On Wednesday night, we'll be continuing in our study of the early church. We'll be looking at Paul's missionary journeys. Next Sunday morning, we're continuing in our sermon message series of things that we as Christians should be doing. We talked about prayer, and then we've looked at how we should, read and study the Scriptures. And then next we'll be, starting Sunday, we'll be into the topic of giving. And so that's where we'll be at on Sunday. And Sunday night we'll be into chapter 19 when God goes Old Testament on the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. And so if there's not any other questions, I will ask Matt if he'll close us out with a word of prayer, and we'll be dismissed.